So there I was, Corporal Jake Bulldozer Murphy, crouched behind what used to be a very nice Zephian monument to their glorious whatever the hell, now serving as my personal bullet catcher on the lovely vacation destination known as Kilo 7. And let me tell you, the travel brochures really undersold the active warzone aesthetic. The Zephyrians, bless their scaly little hearts, had been shooting at us for about 6 hours straight. Now, these guys are what you'd call a proud warrior race. You know the type. 7 feet tall, built like refrigerators with anger management issues, and they've got this whole honor and glory thing going on. They look at humans and see soft pink mammals, who probably cry at sad movies. Which, to be fair, I totally do, but that's beside the point. The thing about the Zephyrians is they've never quite figured out that humans don't fight like every other species in the galaxy. Most civilized races have these neat little rules about warfare. Designated battle zones, scheduled conflicts, probably catered lunch breaks for all I know. Humans, we're the kind of species that shows up to a sword fight with a bazooka and then asks why everyone's looking at us funny. But today was different. Today, the Zephyrians had pulled something that made even my combat-hardened, morally flexible conscience do a little backflip. Through my scope, I could see their defensive position about 200 meters out, and there, huddled behind their energy barriers, were about a dozen Zephyrian cubs. Now, I've seen some messed up stuff in my 12 years of military service. I've fought on 17 different worlds, been shot at by creatures that shouldn't technically exist according to physics, and once had to explain to my commanding officer why I'd accidentally started a religious war on a planet where the locals worshipped household appliances. But using your own kids as human shields? That was a new low, even for a species that considered recreational gladiator combat a family bonding activity. The cubs couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years old in human equivalent, and they were absolutely terrified. Their big golden eyes, the only soft thing about Zephyrian anatomy, kept darting around like they were trying to figure out which direction the danger was coming from. Spoiler alert, kids, it was coming from all directions. "Murphy?" Lieutenant Torres crawled up next to me, her voice barely audible over the sound of energy weapons turning perfectly good oxygen into very expensive light shows. "Command's ordering a tactical withdrawal. These lizard jerks have us pinned down, and air support is 20 minutes out." I kept my eye on that defensive position. The Zephyrian adults were firing over the cubs' heads, using them as living cover. Every time my squad tried to return fire, we'd hesitate because nobody wanted to explain to the brass why we'd turned a bunch of alien toddlers into collateral damage. War crimes tribunals are notoriously bad for career advancement. "Did you hear me, Murphy?" Torres grabbed my shoulder. "We're pulling back." "Yeah, I heard you." I finally looked away from my scope. "Just processing the tactical situation." "What tactical situation?" "We retreat, we regroup, and we let the flyboys turn this place into a parking lot." I pointed toward the enemy position. "You see those cubs, Lieutenant?" Torres raised her own binoculars and went very, very quiet. After about 30 seconds, she lowered them and looked at me with the expression of someone who just realized her subordinate was about to do something monumentally stupid. "Murphy, no. I didn't say anything. You've got that look. The look that says you're about to do something that'll either get you a medal or a court-martial, possibly both. Here's the thing about being called Bulldozer. It's not because I'm particularly large or intimidating. I mean, I'm a solid 6'0" of pure Kentucky stubbornness, but I've seen plenty of bigger Marines. No, the nickname comes from my tendency to approach problems with all the subtlety of construction equipment. Obstacle in my way? Drive through it. Enemy fortification? Drive through it. Complex diplomatic situation requiring delicate handling? You guessed it. Drive straight through the middle and see what happens. This particular character flaw has gotten me in trouble more times than I care to count. Like that incident on Proxima Station where I may have accidentally challenged the Thurian ambassador to single combat because I thought he was insulting my mother. Turns out he was just commenting on human dietary habits. But cultural misunderstandings aside, I stand by my actions. The point is, when I see those cubs being used as living shields, every rational part of my brain starts screaming at me to follow orders, pull back, and let someone else figure it out. Unfortunately, the rational part of my brain has never been in charge of major decisions. That honor goes to the part that once convinced me to enlist, because my high school guidance counselor said I'd never amount to anything significant. See, I grew up in foster care. Bounced around between families who were either too busy, too broke, or too messed up to deal with a kid who had what my caseworker diplomatically called authority issues. By the time I was 17, I'd lived in 14 different homes and attended 9 different schools. You learn real quick that sometimes the adults who are supposed to protect you are the same ones who'll throw you under the bus when things get complicated. So when I see those Zephyrian cubs huddled behind their parents who are using them as human shields, or alien shields, whatever, something, in my brain just snaps. Not in a crazy way, mind you. More like a really expensive piece of military equipment that's been functioning perfectly fine until you need it most, and then it decides to interpret its programming in the most literal and inconvenient way possible. Murphy, I can see the gears turning in that empty head of yours, Torres said, her voice taking on that dangerous tone that superior officers use when they're about to remind you exactly how many different ways they can ruin your life. Whatever you're thinking, stop thinking it. I'm just thinking it's a nice day for a walk. A walk in the middle of an active combat zone? Fresh air is good for you, Lieutenant. Clears the head. Private Kowalski, who'd been quietly having what appeared to be a religious experience every time an energy bolt came within 10 feet of his position, crawled over to join our little strategy session. Sarge, please tell me you're not planning what I think you're planning. I don't know what you think I'm planning, Kowalski. You're planning to walk out there and get those cubs, aren't you? See? That's where you're wrong. I started checking my gear with the methodical precision of someone who's about to do something incredibly stupid and wants to do it right. I'm not planning anything. Planning implies I've thought this through. Torres grabbed my arm. Jake, listen to me. I know you've got some kind of hero complex, but this is suicide. Those are enemy combatants using their own children as shields. It's horrible, but it's not our problem. You're right, I said, which seemed to visibly relieve her until I continued. It's my problem. That's not how military command structure works. Lieutenant, with all due respect, military command structure got us into a situation where we're pinned down by lizard people who think child endangerment is a valid tactical doctrine. Maybe it's time to try something different. The rest of my squad had gathered around by now, probably drawn by the sound of their sergeant having what could generously be called a psychotic episode. There was Rodriguez, my demolitions expert, who looked like he was already calculating blast patterns for maximum dramatic effect. Chen. Not to be confused with any Sarah Chens, this was Billy Chen, our medic, who had the unfortunate habit of being right about everything medical, including his frequent predictions about which of my plans were going to get me killed. Bulldozer, Chen said in that patient voice he used when explaining why jumping off buildings wasn't an effective combat tactic. Those cubs are 200 meters away through active gunfire. The Zephyrians have energy weapons, plasma cannons, and what appears to be some kind of automated defense system. You'll be dead before you make it 50 feet. Billy, my friend, you have such little faith in the power of human stupidity. I have tremendous faith in human stupidity. That's exactly why I know this won't work. I stood up, which caused everyone to duck because apparently my head was now a priority target for every Zephyrian with a functioning weapon. Here's the thing, guys. Those cubs didn't ask to be born into a warrior culture that thinks honor is more important than common sense. They didn't ask to be used as human shields by their own parents. And they didn't ask to be caught in the middle of a war between their people and a bunch of humans who are just trying to keep the galaxy from falling apart. It's very philosophical, Torres said through gritted teeth, but it doesn't change the tactical reality. Maybe not, but here's what I know about tactical reality. Sometimes the most tactically sound decision is also the most morally bankrupt one. And sometimes, just sometimes, doing the right thing is so absolutely insane that it actually works, because nobody expects it. I finished checking my weapon and started moving toward the edge of our cover. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? You die! The entire squad shouted in unison. Well, yeah, there's that. But think about it. If I die doing something this stupid, you guys will have the best war story ever. Remember that time Bulldozer got himself killed trying to rescue enemy cubs? That's the kind of story that gets you free drinks for life. Torres made one last desperate attempt to inject sanity into the situation. Murphy, as your commanding officer, I am ordering you to stand down. I paused and looked back at her. Lieutenant, as your subordinate who's about to commit an act of insubordination so spectacular that it'll either end my career or start a new chapter in the manual for unconventional warfare, I respectfully acknowledge your order and choose to interpret it as a strong suggestion. And with that, I stepped out from behind our cover and started walking toward 200 meters of open ground. Active enemy fire, and what was either going to be the most heroic thing I'd ever done, or the stupidest way anyone had ever gotten themselves killed in the history of interstellar warfare. Well, I muttered to myself as the first energy bolt sizzled past my head. This is either heroic or really stupid, probably both. Now, I want you to understand something about walking through enemy fire. It's not like in the movies where the hero struts confidently through explosions while dramatic music plays and his hair somehow stays perfectly styled. In reality, it's more like trying to cross a busy highway while wearing a neon sign that says free target practice and hoping that everyone shooting at you has really terrible aim. The first 50 meters were what I like to call the "oh God, what have I done" phase. Energy bolts were zipping past my head with that distinctive whine that sounds like angry wasps having an argument with a power drill. The Zephyrs were clearly confused by my approach. Probably because most sensible species would have taken cover by now, or at least shown some basic survival instincts. But here's the thing about humans that other species never quite grasp. We're not sensible. We're the species that looked at fire and thought, I bet I can make this even more dangerous by putting it in a metal tube and shooting things with it. We're the ones who discovered faster-than-light travel, not through careful scientific research, but because some maniac decided to see what would happen if you fed a nuclear reactor nothing but coffee and bad decision. Really? I called out to the Zephyrian position as a particularly close shot singed my eyebrows. Purple energy bolts? That's what you went with? I mean, I appreciate the aesthetic choice, very regal, but couldn't you have picked something a little less visible, maybe a nice earth tone? Something that blends with the scenery? The shooting actually slowed down for a moment, probably because they were trying to figure out if the human was trash-talking their weapon design in the middle of a firefight, which, to be fair, I absolutely was. By the 100-meter mark, I'd entered what military tacticians would probably classify as the statistically impossible survival zone. According to every computer model ever created, I should have been dead 17 different ways by now. But computer models don't account for the most powerful force in the universe: human spite. I was too annoyed at the situation to die. You know what your problem is? I continued my one-sided conversation with my would-be executioners. No creativity. It's all point and shoot with you guys. Where's the artistry? Where's the flair? Back on Earth, we had a guy named Vincent van Gogh who could have taught you something about creative expression. Granted, he cut off his own ear, but still, the man had style. I could see the cubs more clearly now, and they were staring at me like I was some kind of mythical creature, which, considering I was a human walking through a combat zone while giving art history lectures, wasn't entirely inaccurate. Their big golden eyes were wide, with a mixture of terror and fascination, like they couldn't decide if I was there to save them or eat them. The Zephyrian adults, meanwhile, were having what appeared to be a heated discussion about proper shooting techniques. I could hear them arguing in their language, which sounds like someone trying to speak English while gargling gravel. From what I could make out with my limited Zephian vocabulary, roughly half of them wanted to concentrate fire and turn me into a crispy, human-shaped hole in the ground, while the other half seemed to be suggesting that maybe they should see what this crazy mammal was actually planning to do. At the 150-meter mark, something interesting happened. One of the younger Zephyrian soldiers, you can tell because they haven't developed the full shoulder spikes yet, actually lowered his weapon slightly and tilted his head at me. I waved at him. Hey there, buddy. Nice day for a war, isn't it? Though I have to say, your timing could use some work. Do you guys always schedule these things during lunch? Because I'm getting really hungry. And there's a sandwich back at base with my name on it. Well, technically it just says property of J. Murphy, but you get the idea. The young soldier looked around at his companions, then back at me, then shook his head in what I'm pretty sure was the universal gesture for, I have no idea what's happening right now, but I'm pretty sure it's not supposed to be happening. That's when I heard it. The sound that every parent, regardless of species, recognizes instantly. One of the cubs was crying. Not the angry, demanding cry of a child having a tantrum, but the scared, hopeless cry of someone who's too young to understand why the world has suddenly become a terrifying place. And that, right there, was when my leisurely stroll through enemy fire became something else entirely. All right, that's enough of that, I announced to no one in particular, and broke into what could generously be called a jog, if you ignored the fact that I was still taking time to dodge energy bolts and maintain running commentary on Zephyrian military tactics. The last 50 meters were a blur of adrenaline, laser fire, and increasingly creative swear words in 3 different languages. I reached their defensive perimeter just as Commander Vexar, I could tell he was the commander because he had the biggest shoulder spikes and the most elaborate face tattoos, stepped forward to meet me. Now Vextar was about 7.5 feet of pure Zephyrian warrior, built like a tank with anger management issues and wearing armor that probably cost more than my annual salary. He looked down at me with the expression of someone trying to solve a particularly challenging math problem, except the math problem was covered in sweat, slightly singed around the edges, and had just walked through 200 meters of active gunfire to have a conversation. "Human," he said, in accented but perfectly clear English. "You are either the bravest creature I have ever encountered, or the most spectacularly stupid." I looked up at him, wiped some soot off my face, and grinned. Why not both? Behind him, the cubs were huddled together, 12 pairs of golden eyes staring at me like I was either their salvation or the galaxy's weirdest predator. The smallest one, who couldn't have been more than 4 years old, was still crying. "So," I said to Vexstar, gesturing toward the cubs, "we going to stand here and discuss my mental health, or are we going to do something about the fact that you're using children as human shields? Because, I've got to tell you, Commander, that's not exactly covering your species in glory." Vexstar's face went through about 17 different expressions in the span of 3 seconds. Confusion, anger, indignation, more confusion, what might have been embarrassment, and finally settling on something that looked like grudging respect, mixed with the dawning realization that he was dealing with a complete lunatic. "You walked through active combat to lecture me on military ethics?" he asked, his voice carrying that tone that suggests someone is reconsidering their life choices. "Well, when you put it like that, it does sound a little preachy," I admitted. "But yeah, pretty much. See, where I come from, we have this crazy idea that maybe, just maybe, you don't use kids as bullet catchers. Call me old-fashioned." The cubs had stopped crying and were now staring at me with the kind of fascination usually reserved for natural disasters or really good magic tricks. I crouched down to their level, which put me face to face with 12 pairs of the biggest, most expressive eyes I'd ever seen on any species. "Hey there, little ones," I said in what I hoped was a reassuring tone. "Sorry about all the noise. The grown-ups are having a disagreement about proper battlefield etiquette." The smallest cub, a little female with bright silver scales mixed in with the usual Zephyrian green, took a tentative step toward me. She said something in their language that I didn't understand, but the tone was universal. It was the sound of a scared child asking if everything was going to be okay. "I know, kiddo, I know." I looked up at Vexstar. "Here's the deal, Commander. I'm going to take these cubs back to my position. You can shoot at me if it makes you feel better about the whole situation, but I'm asking you not to shoot at them. Professional courtesy, one warrior to another." Vexstar's head tilted slightly, which I'd learned was the Zephyrian equivalent of raising an eyebrow. "You would carry enemy children through combat." "I would carry children through combat. The enemy part is just unfortunate timing." What happened next was something that military historians would probably spend decades analyzing. Vexstar looked at his cubs, looked at me, looked at his soldiers, and then did something that went against every piece of Zephyrian military doctrine ever written. He stepped aside. "You are insane," he said simply. "Yeah, I get that a lot." I scooped up the smallest cub, who immediately wrapped her tiny arms around my neck with the desperate grip of someone who'd found an adult who wasn't actively using her as a tactical advantage. "Come on, sweetheart, let's get you somewhere safe." The walk back was where things got really interesting. See, carrying a scared alien child through a firefight while 11 more cubs follow behind you like the galaxy's most dangerous parade requires a certain amount of tactical creativity. Mostly it requires accepting that you're probably going to die, and deciding to make it as educational as possible. "Now, kids," I said in my best tour guide voice as we started across the open ground, "if you look to your left, you'll see my squad mates having what appears to be a collective nervous breakdown. That's Lieutenant Torres, and she's probably composing my obituary right now. Very thorough woman, the lieutenant. I'm sure it'll be very flattering." The cubs, bless them, seemed to understand that I was trying to keep them calm, even if they couldn't follow the words. They stayed close, moving in a tight group, with the smaller ones holding onto the older ones. It was like watching a real-time lesson in how not all instincts are bad, even in a warrior species. About halfway back, something remarkable happened. The Zephyrian fire stopped. Not slowed down, not redirected, stopped. Complete silence except for the sound of small feet on rough ground, and my continued commentary on the local scenery. "And if you look behind us," I said without turning around, "you'll notice that your relatives have apparently decided that shooting at a human carrying their children might not be the best tactical decision. Shows remarkable restraint, really. I'm impressed." What I couldn't see, but learned about later from Torres's after-action report, was that Commander Vexstar was having what could only be described as the most intense, silent argument in military history with his senior staff. No words, just a lot of meaningful looks, aggressive posturing, and the kind of nonverbal communication that happens between warriors who've served together long enough to have entire conversations with facial expression. The end result was that not only did they stop shooting at me, but when human fire started coming from my squad's position, because apparently Torres had decided that covering fire was more important than following regulations, several Zephyrian soldiers actually started providing suppressing fire against their own automated defense systems. "Well, would you look at that," I muttered, shifting the cub in my arms to a more comfortable position. "The people who were trying to kill me 5 minutes ago are now helping me not get killed by their own equipment. That's either really heartwarming or a sign that I've completely lost touch with reality." The little female cub looked up at me and said something that sounded like a question. I didn't know what she was asking, but I figured honesty was probably the best policy. "I don't know either, kiddo, but sometimes the best thing you can do is just keep walking and see what happens." By the time we reached the 75-meter mark, I had acquired what military strategists would probably classify as the strangest escort formation in recorded history. Human covering fire from the front, Zephyrian covering fire from behind, and me, in the middle, carrying scared children while providing color commentary on the tactical situation. "You know what the really funny part is?" I called out to anyone who might be listening. "This is probably going to end up in some kind of diplomatic manual, Chapter 12, Unconventional Approaches to Hostage Situations. They'll probably make it required reading at the academy." The cubs were starting to relax a little, probably because children have an amazing ability to adapt to insane situations, as long as the adults around them pretend everything is under control. The older ones were even starting to look around with curiosity instead of terror, like they were finally processing the fact that the scary human was actually trying to help them. That's when I heard Vexstar shout something in Zephyrian that I was pretty sure translated to, "Cease fire all positions." The automated systems powered down with a high-pitched whine, and suddenly the battlefield was quieter than it had been all day. "Great," I said to my small audience. "Now I'm being helped by the people who were shooting at me. This is either the weirdest rescue mission in history or the most elaborate practical joke anyone's ever played on a Marine from Kentucky." The smallest cube giggled at that, which was simultaneously the most adorable and most surreal sound I'd ever heard in a combat zone. "Yeah, I know," I told her. "Humans are weird. You'll get used to it." By the time I reached our defensive line with my entourage of confused alien children, I was running, on pure adrenaline, spite, and what Chen would later diagnose as catastrophic dehydration combined with minor heat stroke. The cubs were safe, I was somehow still breathing, and both sides had apparently decided that shooting at each other was less important than figuring out what the hell had just happened. Torres met me at the perimeter, her face cycling through relief, anger, and professional exasperation. "Murphy, you magnificent suicidal idiot. Are you hurt?" "Just my pride," I said, carefully setting down the smallest cub, who immediately attached herself to my leg like a very determined silver-scaled barnacle. "And possibly my career prospects. How's the Enter-Colonel going to react to me conducting unauthorized diplomatic negotiations in the middle of a firefight? Considering you just prevented what would have been the galaxy's worst PR disaster, I think your career prospects are fine." She looked down at the cubs, who were huddled together but seemed remarkably calm considering they'd just been carried through a war zone by an alien. "Jesus, Murphy, they're so small." "Yeah, well, apparently Zephyrian parenting involves some questionable tactical decisions." I tried to detach the small cub from my leg, but she just held on tighter. "Hey there, kiddo. You're safe now. These are the good humans. Well, they're humans anyway." Billy Chen appeared with his medical kit, and that expression he gets when he's trying to figure out how someone managed to survive something that should have been mathematically impossible. "Bulldozer, sit down. You look like death warmed over." "I feel great. Never been better. Might take up professional suicide missions as a hobby." "Sit down." I sat down, mostly because my legs had apparently decided they were done with this whole supporting body weight thing. The cubs immediately clustered around me, which was both heartwarming and tactically inconvenient. That's when Commander Vexstar appeared at our perimeter, flanked by 2 of his senior warriors, but notably not pointing any weapons at us. He looked at me, sitting on the ground surrounded by cubs, looked at Torres, who was clearly trying to figure out proper first contact protocol, and then shook his massive head. "Human Murphy," he said formally. "Commander Vexstar," I replied, attempting to stand up and immediately being pushed back down by Chen. "Nice to see you again. Thanks for not shooting me." "Thank you for not making me explain to the Warrior Council why I allowed the cubs of my clan to die because of tactical doctrine." He paused, looking at the cubs who were chattering away in rapid Zephyrian, probably telling each other stories about their adventure with the crazy human. They are unharmed? Scared, but yeah, they're fine. Kids are tougher than adults give them credit for. This is true. Vexstar crouched down, bringing his imposing height closer to eye level. The cubs immediately ran to him, babbling excitedly. The smallest one, my little silver-scaled shadow, pointed at me and said something that made Vexstar's eyebrows raise. What did she say? I asked. She says you told them not to be afraid because sometimes the best thing you can do is just keep walking and see what happens. He looked at me with something that might have been respect. She also says you smell like fear sweat and determination. Kids are brutally honest. It's one of their better qualities. Torres cleared her throat. Commander, I need to ask, what's your status? Are we still technically shooting at each other, or… Lieutenant Torres, Vexstar said, somehow knowing her name, despite never having been introduced. I believe we have reached what your species would call an impasse. Your warrior violated every conventional rule of engagement, committed an act so tactically unsound it borders on insanity, and in doing so, demonstrated more honor than my own actions showed. Hey now, I protested weakly. Let's not get carried away. I just didn't want to see kids get hurt. Precisely. Vexstar stood up. Among my people, the protection of cubs is considered the highest duty. Today, a human fulfilled that duty when I failed to. This requires consideration. What happened next was probably the weirdest ceasefire negotiation in military history. Vexstar and Torres started discussing terms while I sat on the ground, serving as a combination jungle gym and security blanket for 12 alien children. Rodriguez kept taking pictures for historical documentation, Chen kept trying to force hydration tablets down my throat, and Kowalski was apparently having some kind of religious experience about the whole situation. You know, I said to the smallest cub who had decided my shoulder was the perfect perch, your people and my people are probably going to spend the next 6 months in committee meetings trying to figure out what today means for interspecies relations. She chirped something that sounded like agreement. Yeah. I'm not looking forward to the paperwork either. The temporary ceasefire they worked out was elegant in its simplicity. Both sides would withdraw to defensive positions, the cubs would be returned to Zephyrian civilian authorities under neutral oversight, and nobody would shoot at anybody else until the diplomats could figure out what the hell to do with a situation where a war had been temporarily paused because a human marine had decided that child welfare was more important than following orders. As the cubs were being prepared for transport, the smallest one looked up at me with those big golden eyes and said something in careful, broken English. Thank you, Human Murphy. I'm not ashamed to admit that might have made me tear up a little. Just allergies, you understand. Combat zones are dusty places. You're welcome, kid, I said. Try to stay out of trouble, okay? Vexstar approached as the cubs were being led away. Human Murphy, what you did today will not be forgotten by my people. Commander, I just did what anyone would have done. No, he said firmly. You did what anyone should have done. There is a significant difference. He clasped my shoulder with one massive hand, nodded to Torres, and walked away to rejoin his forces. Just like that, the strangest day of my military career was over. So, Torres said, watching the Zephyrians withdraw to their positions, how do you feel about being the first human to accidentally negotiate a ceasefire by committing an act of spectacular insubordination? I thought about it for a moment. Honestly, I could really go for that sandwich I mentioned earlier. Fast forward 6 months, and here I am, sitting in what the military euphemistically calls a cultural liaison office, but what everyone else recognizes as the place where they stick problem soldiers who've become too famous to court-martial, but too unpredictable to put back in the field. My official title is Senior Instructor, Advanced Interspecies Relations, which sounds impressive until you realize it means I spend most of my time teaching young Marines why walking through enemy fire to rescue alien children is not, despite recent evidence to the contrary, standard operating procedure. The story, of course, has grown in the telling. According to the latest version making the rounds in the enlisted clubs, I single-handedly defeated an entire Zephyrian army using nothing but sarcasm and raw human determination. In some versions, I'm 10 feet tall and bulletproof. In others, the cubs were actually dangerous alien war beasts that I tamed through the power of superior human intellect. The truth, as usual, is both more mundane and more ridiculous than the legend. What really happened was that my moment of spectacular stupidity accidentally demonstrated something that all the diplomatic corps and cultural exchange programs had missed. Sometimes the best way to communicate across species barriers is to just do the right thing and let everyone else figure out the implications later. The Zephyrians, it turns out, had been using the cubs as shields because their military doctrine prioritizes clan survival above individual honor. In their cultural context, sacrificing adult warriors to protect the young makes perfect sense. What they hadn't counted on was encountering a species that was crazy enough to risk individual lives to protect children who weren't even the same species. My little silver-scaled friend, whose name I eventually learned was Sixara, has become something of a celebrity herself. She's apparently told the story of the human who smelled like determination to everyone who will listen, which has led to the most unexpected diplomatic breakthrough in recent history. Zephyrian cubs now regularly request human babysitters. Yeah, you heard that right. Turns out, once you prove you're willing to risk your life for their kids, Zephyrian parents decide you're trustworthy enough to handle diaper duty. My unofficial role as the galaxy's first interspecies childcare specialist has led to more successful diplomatic negotiations than 20 years of formal treaty discussions. Commander Vexstar, who received a formal commendation for innovative tactical flexibility in the face of unprecedented human behavior, stops by whenever his ship is in the system. We usually end up discussing military theory, Zephyrian philosophy, and whether my actions that day were brilliant or just really, really lucky. Both, is his usual conclusion. Definitely both. The really funny part is that my stunt has become required reading at military academies across 3 different species. They call it the Kilo 7 incident in the official reports. But the Marines just call it that time Murphy lost his mind and accidentally started peace talks. Torres, who got promoted to captain partly for her handling of the diplomatic situation and partly for not shooting me when I disobeyed direct orders, likes to remind me that I'm probably the only Marine in history whose insubordination resulted in a commendation rather than a court-martial. You realize, she told me last week, that you've fundamentally changed how the military approaches first contact situations. There's actually a new protocol called the Murphy Doctrine for situations involving non-combatant aliens in hostile environments. Please tell me it's not just walk toward the problem and hope for the best, I said. Close. It's prioritize humanitarian concerns over tactical advantage when dealing with species that demonstrate similar protective instincts toward their young. That's much more diplomatic than my version. These days I spend my time teaching young Marines about cultural sensitivity, proper first contact procedures, and why the phrase, "hold my beer and watch this," should never be part of military planning. It's rewarding work, even if most of my students look at me like I'm a cautionary tale about the long-term effects of too much combat exposure. But sometimes, late at night when I'm grading papers on ethical considerations and interspecies conflict resolution, I get a message from Sixara. She's learning English now, and her notes are usually some variation of, "Hello, human Murphy, I am well, thank you for walking." And every time, I write back the same thing, "You're welcome, kid, keep walking too." Because at the end of the day, that's really all any of us can do. Keep walking, do the right thing when you can, and hope that when the shooting stops, there are still people, human, Zephyrian, or otherwise, worth protecting. Even if it means your new job involves teaching advanced interspecies babysitting to Marines who signed up to shoot things, not change diapers. But hey, at least the pay is good, and I finally got that sandwich.